Maine Heritage Policy Center. They have that thing they call a news service, Maine Wire.
A perfectly round, never-ending, back-padding Congo line.
Maine Heritage Policy Center, from which so many people in Augusta take their marching orders.
You've got a Maine Heritage Policy Center hair across your You have to let that go.
All right, good afternoon. Welcome to this week's episode of the Maine Wire Week in Review. I'm Lance Dutson from the Maine Heritage Policy Center. We're just having a discussion on whether we're going to continue this name of the Maine Wire Week in Review or actually show some creativity by calling this the Barbed Wire or Under the Wire. With me here today is David Crocker and Peter Steele from the Maine Heritage Policy Center as well. So thanks for coming out for another Friday afternoon, guys.
Wouldn't miss it.
I think we should be called Outside the Wire, since we kind of escaped the establishment and the leftist rule and the liberal media. We're way outside the wire on that one.
Well, I've always felt like an alien in a strange land. So,
Stranger. Did you guys ever read that book? Was that Heinlein? Stranger in a Strange Land?
Something like that.
The term grok came from that book, which I think is the greatest term. So exciting week this week. We last episode we discussed Representative Chuck Crocker and his problem with former Vice President Dick Cheney and Twitter. And this week started off with kind of a bang. We came into the office on Monday morning and had a little treat on our answer machine, which was a series of really violent death threats against the Maine Heritage Policy Center. So it's always a heck of a way to start the week off.
Somebody was busy over the weekend. There were, I think, 12 calls that were made over the weekend by people who were basically trying to give us death threats for reporting what a Democratic state representative said in a tweet, which you can't remember, even though it's posted on our website.
yeah, that's right. Even in the rules of evidence, there's such a thing as refreshing one's memory.
Yeah. Well, you know, the amazing thing to me is, as reporters, we're reported on the story. We have a news source, the Maine Wire. We reported on something an elected official did that he shouldn't have done, and we got threats from it. And so, naturally, the camaraderie of the journalism community jumped right in to defend our honor. Actually, never mind. They didn't do that. They jumped in to defend the institution again, which is just amazing to me.
Yeah, they all seem to jump in to defend Freddie. Oh, it isn't Freddie, actually. It's the other Kruger.
Nightmare on Capitol Street.
Yeah.
Well, don't you understand? He's the victim here. He put out a death threat against the Vice President of the United States, but he's the victim. See, and that's how the media sees it. He's the victim because he got some calls telling him what he did was vile. So therefore he's the victim. It's not what he did.
Right.
It's what other people did to him. And I will say that the phone calls that we got, we've all got plenty of phone calls before. People calling in saying, you guys suck, whatever. These phone calls were vile and they were pointed and they were actually very violent.
Scary.
Yeah, very scary. So. It's not going to prevent us from doing our job. I just want to say that we don't really get any relief from those kind of phone calls because we're on the right and they're on the left, so the same protections aren't afforded to us.
I would actually posit that Freddy Krueger is a more sympathetic figure than Chuck Kruger is. But what you said about us being on the right and the double standard on the left, it came so clearly. And Sam Adelson wrote a great piece this week about the comparison of what's going on with Ted Nugent and his strange statements and what's happening in Maine. And the first, the discussion that occurred on the Bangor Daily News at the beginning of this week was about threats and public officials, but it was the Ted Nugent story. It wasn't the one happening right in the backyard.
Yep. And, of course, what made the Ted Nugent story so entertaining is that his remarks were in the context of a speech at the NRA convention. So the subtext here, of course, is whether the Secret Service really wanted to tangle with the NRA. And I noticed that they went through the motions and everyone agreed that there was no real threat. I think that was a foregone conclusion.
Yeah, well, I'll tell you, the reporting that's come out, or the very tiny amount of reporting that's gone out about this incident has been unreal. Friday night, A.J. Higgins did a story on this, And the story was, like you said, Peter, this guy's a victim. He got a threat. And nothing about, first of all, these reporters haven't called us. They were writing these stories about us and the story that we broke that went national. And they refer to us and they quote our stories and everything like that, but they don't bother giving us a call for perspective. AJ's piece was factually inaccurate, and then today, Steve Betts, the new reporter for the Bangor Daily News for the Mid-Coast area, wrote an article that is, and this is a high bar, but this is the worst piece of writing I have seen in the Maine media, and since I can remember, it was riddled with factual inaccuracies. It's biased. And again, he didn't bother calling us.
And what's Betts's background?
So Betts has worked as in the newspaper industry in the Rockland area forever, and when the Courier papers were still around, he was an editor of I guess it was the Courier Gazette in Rockland, and he has the distinction of being the only editor in the state of Maine that endorsed Gene Hay Bright in the 2006 senatorial election.
I just need to say I am impressed that you remembered that name. That's pretty excellent.
I read Gene Hay Bright's book. I think I was, besides Steve Betts, I think I was the only one that has. So he's just got a huge body of editorial work out there, just like Greg Kesich here in Portland.
Well, body of work is we use that term advisedly, right?
Yes, he's said things in print that are really, really liberal. And so now the Bangor Daily, after the Village Soup papers collapsed, they scooped him up to be a writer. And I've got a funny story about Steve Betts. So a couple years ago, I was at an event with a Republican legislator up at the University of Maine. It was Bill Cohen and Bob Woodward were doing a speaking thing to talk about Watergate. So we went up there and we had there was a cocktail reception. Woodward and Cohen and everybody, all the bigwigs were up there during this, and I was having a conversation with Bob Woodward, and I had been a part of a group that reported on the Scooter Libby trial, and Woodward had to testify in the trial, so we were discussing this. So up walks these two goobers. I can't describe him any clearer than that. And it was Dan Dunkel, who was at the time the editor of the Belfast Courier paper, and Steve Betts, who was at the time the editor of the Rockland Courier paper. And Dunkel had a Hawaiian shirt on. This was a highfalutin type of cocktail reception. And so they come up and we do introductions, and Betts is just this little guy that looks like he hides down in the basement at his mom's house or something. And they come up and so we start talking, and Dunkel says Steve Betts broke the John Roberts story. So Woodward, this is probably the greatest investigative journalist, or regarded as the greatest investigative journalist in the history of newspapers, is standing there, and here's these guys from Mid-Coast Maine, and so he hears a John Roberts story, and he says, his eyebrows go up, and he goes, well, oh really, which one was that? Well, Betts had been the first guy to report when Roberts fell down or had some health problem. I think he had a heart issue when he was on vacation in Port Clyde. So he went to the hospital, and Betts and a billion other reporters wrote the story that Chief Justice Roberts is in the hospital. And that's what he was referring to. So the whole conversation devolved from there, and it was an embarrassing thing to be around these guys talking to this guy. So later, I'm with this Republican legislator. We walk from the cocktail reception to the speech, or to the talk that these guys are giving in a different building. We got a little mixed up. We kept noticing these two writers were Dunkel and Betts were kind of within earshot of us. They were kind of lingering around. We figured they were lost too. The next week, they write a column talking about how they followed me around the University of Maine campus. That they decided, hey, let's follow these guys around. They're Republicans. And that was the article. It was the most ridiculous thing that I've ever seen. And that's the level of grown-uppedness, I guess, coming out of Steve Betts. But the Bangor Daily scooped him up, and he wrote just an atrocious story about his friend Chuck Kruger and how he was a victim in this whole thing.
Yeah, I think you got to put this in context too. When you talk about Ted Nugent, Ted's got guts and guns, and he's talking at the NRA. You kind of expect that from Ted. You expect it in that forum. I think what the context here is that people are missing is that Kruger is the head of the moderate caucus. That he's supposed to be the moderate one,
right?
And he's writing things that would fit right in with Ted's type of rhetoric.
Well, I heard Mal Leary on WGAN talking about it. They just touched on this. He was giving his little State House update. And I was just surprised that he said this. So Mal says, it's one thing to think this. I'm paraphrasing, but he basically said, yeah, a lot of people think that, but you don't say it out loud. Well, no, they don't.
Right.
Like, I don't fantasize about my political opponents being hung, having their head pop up, and watching it on a cell phone camera.
You're absolutely right. We may vehemently disagree with people, but we don't wish their death.
Right.
No, of course not. I mean, besides, who else would we make fun of if they were dead?
I know, that's true, right? That's true.
But, I think Mal Leary, one of his biggest complaints was our headline in the story, which is common, when in journalism, a lot of times people will complain, well, if it didn't have that headline. Well, if it didn't have the headline, it's still the story. It's still what he wrote, even if the headline was different. So, and he was complaining that it was, like you said, it was his friend, and he was being painted unfairly. But, his friend seems to have selective memory. So, again, David, can you pull out Exhibit A, please, and present that to the court?
Kruger has also gotten off the hook for being full of bleep on this story from day one. When we first contacted him about this tweet, the first thing he said was he wasn't going to comment on anything he said about Dick Cheney. The next thing he said was, well, I don't remember making that comment. And then in that I don't remember mode, he locked his Twitter account down. So we popped up and we put the screenshot, which we had grabbed. So then he opened his Twitter account back up, and then he says, well, I did say that, and I apologize, but basically he said I didn't say what I obviously said. He said I never urged any kind of execution. I was just making a joke. And then now, through this Betts article, it appears he's completely fabricated some giant story that he was talking on Twitter with someone about Iraq veterans and PTSD, and you can go to the account and there's no such discussion at all on there.
Well, he gets a pass.
Yeah. Well, I heard from one of my sources that they're digging into this right now. It's the same guy that hacked Anthony Weiner's phone. I think he hacked into Kruger's Twitter account. We're waiting on confirmation for that.
That is a person I don't want to meet.
Yes, right.
That hacker. So Peter, there was some interesting news from the Pulitzer organization. Is that how you pronounce it? By the way,
Pulitzer. Yeah,
Pulitzer,
that's how snobs like Crocker pronounce it.
Is that sort of like puberty?
Well, I thought it was interesting that the Portland Press Herald had a story. It said Pulitzer Prizes announced, no fiction prize awarded this year, and which I thought was kind of funny because the Portland Press Herald does print a lot of fiction every day. But I think that the headline should have been Pulitzer Prizes announced, and no award was presented for editorial writing. So I thought that was kind of interesting that. Here you are, in the United States of America, which is supposed to have a very strong, very free press, and no awards were given for editorial writing. So my question is, what does that say about the American press these days?
Yeah, well, it's all kind of the same too. I mean, how many times can you hear the people in the editorial page of newspapers say that Republicans' urge to get spending under control is reckless and is going to hurt poor people? I mean, that's the paraphrase of every editorial that runs.
Yeah, I mean, it's variations on a theme. It's children will die.
Right.
Pick your particular phrase of the week.
So, another exciting thing that happened in Maine news this week or this last week is that Governor LePage exercised for the first time ever the line item veto power to correct two mistakes that the legislature had made in their most recent budget. Now, it was two of a slew of mistakes that they made in the budget, but the governor corrected a couple things. And the line item veto is a weird tool in Maine because in order to enact a budget within the proper time frame, you have to have a 2/3 majority. In order to override a line item veto, you only need a simple majority. So it's almost a futile thing to do. But in this particular case, the governor pointed out two things. One, the Appropriations Committee in the legislature had allowed a problem to persist that would have cost us money and caused us to be outside the scope of federal requirements for reimbursement. So he corrected that. And the other issue was that I'm blanking on the other issue.
On the vetoes? On the veto, the line item veto. Well, all I know is there was a story in the I think it was in the Vanguard Daily News today talking about how once again I think the headline said people will die if that's not what it said exactly.
Oh, it was general assistance, right?
Yeah, general
Right.
assistance, which is being abused. Yeah.
Yeah.
Right, and so we MHPC put a pretty sharply worded pushback out over the weekend, showing our support for what the governor is doing, and the general assistance issue is a great one to talk about because. And now you've seen all these mayors come out, and even Republican mayors. I think Jonathan Labonte was one, and Kerry Reston up in Bangor, saying, no, this is going to kill us. Well, general assistance needs to be looked at. We did a story on the town of Windham and what was going on with their general assistance situation, and it was just out of control. And I think I applaud the governor for having the guts to do it, and he stood up to the Republican legislature, and they backed down.
And I think we should make the point that he's doing exactly what he said he was going to do. This is not news to anybody. He came into the office saying he was going to do this, and I think to his credit, he's also putting together a committee of some people who administer the general assistance programs, and they're going to be coming up with ways to get some structural changes here, which is what's needed. What's been needed for a long time. And once again, the governor's trying to fix something that's been pretty much blown up in the budget for years. Again, going back to Angus King and John Baldacci, I can't. You were talking about some of that in your proposals to eliminate the income tax. How much they expanded government.
That's right. It was ridiculous.
Spending.
I don't think most people get the free market Armageddon that occurred here in the last two administrations before LePage got here. I mean, Baldacci grew the welfare roll 78% in 8 years with a flat level of poverty. Maine people weren't worse off and therefore needed to be in the program. It was the same, but we just kept herding these people onto the program. And yeah, I mean, we talk about the 0% initiative, and I think Maine has the opportunity to eliminate our income tax, put ourselves in a position where we're competitive with other states, and that's something we're going to be talking a lot about. But the stark fact that if we reduced government to the size it was when Angus King took office, we could eliminate the income tax. I mean, I think that's a powerful reminder of the out-of-control growth of government here lately.
Right, and that growth was not occurring in the Department of Inland Fish and Wildlife either. I mean, these were not happening in most of the state departments. It really that growth occurred in two departments. Department of Health and Human Services and Education.
That's right.
And
the population of the state of Maine hasn't increased dramatically since 1994.
Right.
In fact, it's remained relatively flat over that entire period of time.
Right.
So it's really not a terribly strange idea to think about reducing the size of state government back to the size it was at the beginning of the King administration.
Right, I think they make a big issue out of none of these governors had used the line item veto yet, which I think was enacted in 1995. And really, it's too bad that they haven't used it yet. Baldacci and King, they weren't going to do that. They didn't want to be blamed for that. They just went along to get along, and they didn't want to be that guy.
Yeah, I mean, the line item veto, another peculiarity about Maine's line item veto is that it only allows you to adjust dollar amounts, and it only allows you to adjust dollar amounts down. So is it any surprise that Angus King, John Baldacci found no use for it?
Absolutely.
And if I would guess, I mean, Angus probably pushed that so that he could promote this ludicrous idea that he's a fiscal conservative. I read something in the paper again today about him considering himself a fiscal conservative. I've never seen an example of anything fiscally conservative that Angus King has done or said, frankly.
His biggest, I think, obstacle is going to be in this campaign is becoming a woman. Apparently, he needs to become a woman to win this campaign from the stories I was reading last week.
Oh, yeah, there's a great example of a really solid story, bit of reporting out of Maine. A story about the Angus King women's vote and talking about Cynthia Dill, who is the other female in the race. There is the assistant.
She's running?
The assistant majority leader of the Senate, Deb Plowman, is a candidate for U.S. Senate, and she, last time I checked, was a female, and the AP completely ignored her in the article. It was the Democrat and the other Democrat, Angus King, that they were talking about. It's just really astounding. Daily Beast ran a story the other day too that was completely factually inaccurate about Angus, that talked about the fact that Angus was a registered independent, and that the registered independents in Maine were the biggest voting bloc. Well, as we know, there are no registered independents in Maine. You're Republican, Democrat, Green, Libertarian, socialist or whatever your party is, or you're unenrolled. There's no independent party up here.
That's right. I'm glad you didn't say communist, because that's a very dirty term, which would also spark another week-long investigative series about calling someone a communist.
The exact difference or distinction between a progressive and a communist.
Right. Yeah. What did we identified that last week as being?
The progressive's husband has a jet. That's the only difference between.
The progressives don't share the jet the way the communists do.
Right. It's what it boils down to in the end. It's a question of means, not ends.
Right. Yeah.
So another thing that's been going on, and we didn't really cover it this week in the Maine Wire, but this ongoing crusade against Mary Mayhew at the Department of Health and Human Services, it continues to go on, and now Democrats who have constantly tried to defund and dismantle OPEGA, the legislature's Office of Program Evaluation and Government Accountability. Now they want to use this tool to go see what DHHS knew and when they knew it. And the funny thing about it is what Mary Mayhew's been doing has been uncovering what Democrats have been doing for years and trying to fix it.
Right, and some of the Democrats that were instrumental in opposing OPEGA and really did not want to create that agency at all. One of them is Senator Margaret Craven of Lewiston. She opposed OPEGA, and now she's using it, like you said, as a tool to go after DHHS, and she claims that they're being lied to and that there's some kind of cover-up, when in fact the general public has known for probably 10 years that these computer systems never work. People are falling through the cracks. And there was never, I think the Democrats always resisted any kind of investigation into DHHS. They insisted there's no fraud. There's no welfare fraud in Maine. There's no fraud. And there's no reason to look into these things. Now, as you said, now that Mary Mayhew is looking into them and uncovering these things, now all of a sudden they feel the need for a big, review.
Yeah, and I don't think it's really too much to say that, prior to this administration actually taking over the reins at DHHS, nobody, least of all the people who worked at DHHS, knew what the hell was going on there.
And there were people who did know what was going on there, and they were told by mid-level managers not to report it in the past few years. So I think they're pointing the fingers at the wrong people again.
Well, the funny thing about Margaret Craven, too, is that just about a month or 2 months ago, she was condemning the use of OPEGA to investigate the Maine State Housing Authority.
Right.
And probably still is defending McCormick now, even after her resignation, to say that there's nothing going on here.
Yeah, well, that's just one more reason why I couldn't be a Democrat politician. I would have a very hard time arguing on one day that the earth was flat and the next day that it was round.
It's a skill. It's a rhetorical skill that they develop in Augusta, I think. So I think Craven in that group. I just hope that somebody's keeping a file somewhere of what these people say. And
right. Well, I mean, this probably doesn't qualify as editorial writing, but I was reading Bill Nimitz's column the other day. He was talking about this DHHS. I would like to go back. I would like to go back and look up his columns and see how many columns he wrote about the problems at DHHS that were well known when King instituted part of the computer system, and then Baldacci. So I'd like to go back and see if we can find any of those.
You think that's a thick archive of criticism?
Yeah, it's probably pretty thin file if there's one.
Yeah, and I'm sure Bill was regularly attending meetings and hearings in Augusta, right, to get to the bottom of what was going on
absolutely.
at DHHS.
I'm sure he had. I'm sure he had concern about that explosive growth of health and human services spending.
Well, of course, you don't want people to die like the guy that's in the newspaper today, who's a German citizen who moved to Texas with his wife and got divorced, then wanted to go to Canada, didn't have a visa, so he stayed in Maine, and now he's going to lose some health benefits.
Is that what that Aroostook?
Oh, yes, it is. That's exactly what it is. Yeah.
I saw all I saw was a headline. Aroostook, and that was in the Bangor Daily.
That's
right.
Yeah.
The Aroostook man unfairly get kicked off.
Right. Are we violating the Constitution? I mean, it sounds like the guy has some problems, and that's too bad. But it's not exactly a Maine resident who's who needs these services. But
is he a citizen?
He's not a U.S. citizen. He's a German citizen. He lived in Texas with his U.S. Citizen wife. They got divorced. He came up this way. I think he wanted to go to Canada. Did not have a visa, so he stayed in Maine. And now that the state is conforming to basically, I think what at least 35 other states conform to, he's going to lose some of his health benefits.
Wow.
So, and he may die before he gets treatment. And they said that right in the story. You know.
So do they have socialized medicine in Germany?
They probably do. I think.
I believe so.
I'm sure they do.
I wonder if the administration would give him a plane ticket on Lufthansa.
Or at least get him the visa to Canada. Drive him over the border.
Well, a ticket back to Germany might be a whole lot cheaper, actually.
That's right.
Whatever
Absolutely.
Even first class.
Yeah.
There was no reason given why his wife divorced him, by the way. But
Yeah. Yes.
she probably had enough of this stuff.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. You think her medical plan could... I guess you get booted off the plan once you get divorced, is that right?
Yeah, I feel bad for the guy. I'm not saying I don't feel bad for the guy, but it just points to, you can't have a policy that fits every single person in every single circumstances every single time. It's just not possible.
Yeah, you got to have... I mean, there's got to be a rule somewhere. You just
That's right,
can't keep feeding, doling money out across the board. And those people that are on the edge that don't get the free stuff aren't going to be happy, but
Right.
the only other solution is just to give everybody everything and kill the golden goose, which is what we've been doing up here forever. Well, I think we've kind of hit the end of our time limit here again on a Friday. Time flies when you're having fun and making fun of liberals, but that's kind of what we do here. So
Right. And we do not wish any death on any liberals. We'll have nothing to talk about every Friday. So.
that's right. Yeah.
Yeah, well, you better hide that hangman who's just over in the corner, Lance.
This is not George Allen's office here. Okay, this is a hangman-free zone in here. But one we do have an exciting week coming up. This Thursday we kick off our Getting to Zero income tax elimination plan here with a roundtable discussion with Solomon Millett from the governor's office. He's the chief of the governor's budget crew up there, and Scott Moody, our chief economist, and myself will be having a nice little conversation at DeMillo's, and should be an exciting time. I think we're going to actually podcast that event as well. So if we say anything useful, we'll be playing clips of that as well. But thanks again to you guys for being out here this afternoon, and we'll talk to everybody next week.
Great. Goodbye.
See ya.